Hello everyone, and welcome back to Keys. In this edition, we're going to explore what we can do to increase our chances of success in today's very challenging and changing environment. So we have, as usual, a group of experts who will share evidence and their thinking on what it takes to stand out from the crowd in several areas, from innovation to communication to employee motivation. And we will start by tackling the very hot topic of inflation, which is at the very top of what worries people around the world today. Simon will guide us on what we know and what we can learn from the past. And then we will hear from Zhongming, who will discuss implications on our product portfolios and what we should be thinking about to optimize. Then Adam will talk about the enigma of creativity and will share an analysis on how to make our creative muscle work better to spark brand growth. And Ananya will put this into perspective with examples from her own country, India. Finally, in A New Deal at Work, Ghassan will share the findings of a brand new report on how to make the most of hybrid working, which is something that we are all have been experiencing a lot and that has been giving a lot to think about, both to employers and employees. And now over to you, Simon.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As Jennifer says, our reference point are today's uncertain times, and unfortunately, it feels we need to start by having a think about inflation. We've been looking at what we know about the topic, bringing together some of the recent evidence. So I'm going to look particularly at the public opinion data we've been collecting, and then Zhongming will pick up on the question of what that means for the organizations and the brands that we work for. Lots and lots of evidence out there, and we put some of it on the webinar homepage for you to explore later if that's helpful for you. But one of the reasons we wanted to talk about inflation to start with is because a year ago we wouldn't have started this webinar with this topic. It was in 9th place in our What Worries the World study. You had to scroll through many pages of our report to find in something called the full list, inflation some way down the chart. But at the same time, it would be wrong for us to think about inflation only arrived overnight as a topic, perhaps in the wake of the war in Ukraine. Because by the end of last year, we were already finding that people were starting to notice that prices seemed higher than they had been. We were already finding people concerned that prices were going to rise in their country faster than people's incomes. Now, what's the picture? Well, coming back to that What Worries the World reference point, which tracks people's worries every single month, a big reminder that some of the big worries never go away: poverty, crime, unemployment. We had to add, of course, coronavirus very quickly to our questionnaire a couple of years ago. It's really fallen away fast in the last few months, and it's inflation that has taken its place. It's moved to the front of our report, and indeed to be the headline of our report as the top worry now for the first time since we started collecting that data. Now, on the call today, we've got people from 80 countries around the world, and we, of course, are seeing very big differences by individual country. Inflation isn't the #1 concern everywhere, but there is still a pretty consistent picture that concerns about inflation are rising everywhere, and this chart illustrates that, I think, quite vividly for us. What about the now, that people's sentiments now? Here I'm going to draw on an 11-country study that we've released recently, and we've got a new one building that out to 27 countries, which will be launched later in the month, really trying to get the mood about how people are feeling to complement the data that you will have on your detailed, the details of your own brand or organization or country. And I particularly wanted to pull out this theme about getting by, or more particularly, just about getting by. If you look at the orange group there, it's quite a significant number of people, and it raises questions about in the coming months, will we see more people self-assess themselves towards the right of the chart, as we do in Turkey, who are now actually finding it difficult? And what does that mean for the choices they make about how they spend the money that they do have available to them, particularly in an environment where there remains real uncertainty about the future. This is future pessimism, not about the economy of my country, but about my own standard of living. Again, you on the call will have detailed data on what's most important to you, but interesting perhaps to reflect on what people around the world are saying about how they may change their behaviours. So we're looking at whether price rises, if they mean you can no longer afford your normal lifestyle, what would you do? And the two big things that stand out in terms of what we say, spending less money on socializing, delaying perhaps large purchase decisions, those more discretionary items are what we say. More on that in the report, which I'll leave you to look at later. But for today's webinar, I thought I would just quickly highlight these numbers in orange, because for now, relatively few people are saying they're looking for work in another place and or indeed asking for a pay rise. Ghassan will touch on those issues in more detail a little bit later on. But for just to complete this brief review, this question about what will happen next, I think is just worth reflecting on for one more moment. Certainly a near consensus that the rate of inflation is something that is with us, that it's going to have an impact on our standards of living, and it's the food, shopping and the utilities where we're particularly thinking that prices are going to rise. And of course, these are the two areas, including in richer countries, where they really are a large proportion of people's expenditure. So as we complete the review, three things I felt seemed really relevant to us in putting this together. The point about just about getting by and monitoring that as a number, how does that change? And what it means for those people who are really concerned, particularly with we think that further price rises are still coming. So that sense of being out of equilibrium, very much worth thinking about what that means for individual consumers as they make their choices. We're saying we'll cut spending on socializing and large purchases, but this is, as I would say, the broad mood in terms of where we are. We've got much more detail in our report for you to explore in more detail. We've tried to pull out a number of things that we've found so far about consumers, about inflation, how they think and what they may do. But for now, I'll leave that and hand it back to Jennifer in the studio.
Thank you very much for updating us on the public mood, Simon. Very important to keep this in mind as we work on our businesses. And so it's the right time to hand over to John Ming to tell us what we should be thinking about when we work on our product portfolios within this context.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. So when our consumers are worried, obviously our clients are worried as well. So these days we're getting this question a lot. How do we make our product portfolio inflation resilient? To the point that we have published a playbook that shares a few tips to do exactly that. So today I'm going to share a few of those tips. And if I have to summarize this whole playbook into one word, that will be differentiation. Differentiation is the key and a recipe to success that keeps coming up, that reduces the substitutability of your product proposition and increases your inflation resilience. So here is an example. In Brazil, we have clients that works in the instant coffee industry. This is a very homogenized and commoditized category, lots of pricing competition. And this client wanted to break through. They wanted to use innovation as a means to increase their resilience to the upcoming inflation. So Ipsos has helped this client landed on a concept for innovation, which is an instant espresso. So this instant espresso is claiming cafe-like experience targeting indulgence occasions. In this particular case, we were able to prove that this concept has a lot of differentiation versus the competitors in the category. And then in the subsequent pricing pressure test, we put this concept into test. What if the price increases? What if inflation hits at 4%, 11%? And in this particular case, you can see that this instant espresso coffee was able to sustain a larger price increase than its competitive leader. So with a 4% increase in price, the volume only drops 2%, versus the same 4% price increase would lead to 11% volume loss for the category leader. And when the price increases a higher scenario, Under 11%, this instant espresso was only 5% loss. The category leader would be losing a whopping 19%. So differentiation is really proven to work in reducing the substitutability, but how do you do it? So a few tips here. One way to do this is through superiority. So one approach that we have found to work over and over again is overlaying superior claims to increase that resilience. Here is an example in the US. We put consumers into a lab environment, showing them new shampoo launches that are either carrying some of the expected category entry-level claims, such as moisturizing, repair and replenish. But sometimes we will show these experiments with a few claims that are beyond the core. For example, sustainable packaging, sulfate-free, no silicones. And each time when we rotate these claims that we show to consumers, we would also change the price, and we observe whether the consumers are going to pick these new innovations or market leaders such as Pantene. So what we found in this case was very, very interesting. So when we are only making category entry requirement claims such as moisturizing, we're seeing that the win for this innovation drops 11% for each of the $1 price increase that we put on this product. But when you make either one or more than one beyond the core claims, superiority claims like these, then the choice would drop only 6%. So you can see the resilience increases a lot when the superior claim is there. Now, we also say that not all the claims, superiority claims, work in the same way. You have to find the right claims to differentiate yourself with. So we have a lot of learning on this aspect as well. We have a type of study which we call permissibility to pay, which is exactly examining which claim is able to carry these premiumization tasks and do a better job. So in this US beverage brand example, we have validated over 20 superiority claims for this client. We invited consumers into a shelf environment. We put these superiority claims on the packagings, and we observe what consumers to choose and at each price level. So what we were able to find out is that there is a vast performance difference from the better performing ones versus the worst performing ones. Over 2/3 of these claims that we have tested, in this case, over 20 of them, was completely ineffective. In other words, when the price increases, the volume would drop. But we were able to find one claim that is in the functional wellness area that is able to support as much as 29% price increase without losing current share of choice. So the point here is it's very, very important that we look into which claim can actually do the job that we want the product to do. A third tip that I want to share here is that you can also differentiate yourself by inviting consumers to compare your product to a different set of competitors that are more premium and different. So the point here is that expensiveness is always a relative term, right? Whether something is expensive or cheap depends on what consumer compare you to. Now, in this particular case, as an example, in the UK, it was a manufacturer of antibacterial soap. When they are on the regular soap aisle, we can see that this product is $2.49. It might actually be quite premium, quite expensive compared to its peers that are maybe in the £1 or £1.50 range. So this client was very, very innovative. So what they did is they then put the soap into a gadget such as this, into a hand pump gadget. And now all of a sudden, consumers are more likely to compare this product to bathroom gadgets, which is of course at a higher price level. And at £12, this is not really viewed as a very expensive product. And they went on further to introduce this powered pump, which provides touchless, a sensor that provides touchless pumping. So now you're at £39, but consumers at this point are benchmarking you to small kitchen appliances or bathroom appliances, and they actually don't think it expensive, right? So this example illustrates that expensiveness is a relative term. What consumer compare you to is determining whether they think it's expensive or if it's cheap. And we can use new product innovations to invite people to compare you to something that is slightly on the premium angle. Now, last tip I will share today is sometimes you just can't resist increasing the price. But even at that point, you have tactical choices to make. Do you raise price directly? Do you downsize, or do you bring a restage to make the product look different, at the same time a smaller size, right? So differentiation also has a role to play even in these tactical strategies. So here's an example from the US again. It's a mouthwash maker. So they are planning to do a downsize, but in this particular case, they didn't just downsize right out. What they did is they launched a new package and also carries a few new functionality claims with this new package. And essentially, it was marketed as a relaunch of the product. So in this particular case, you can see that the true intention was to lower the size by about 6% here. But when they were doing it in the format of a relaunch with a new package and new functionality claims, and we put this into the test, we actually observed that the share of choice did not erode. The new package is so attractive that it was able to overcome the size loss, and the consumer did not notice it, at least in the short term. So it was a proven to be a very successful short-term strategy. And this is the type of phenomenon we see over and over again with downsizing. When you put differentiating points onto a downsized package, it was able to overcome the size loss. Now, one cautionary note here is that in this today's age, consumers are really savvy and knowledgeable, and honesty and transparency is really valued. So we have to be very careful about bad press hurting company reputation in the long term when consumers bring the product home and realize that the product is a little bit smaller than what they used to. So something to watch out for. Now, in summary, one keyword to an inflation resilient portfolio is differentiation. You can differentiate through superiority, but you have to find the right claim to differentiate with. Smart competitive framing, inviting your consumers to compare your product to a premium tier of competitors is a very smart way to do that. And you can also play the differentiation card when you do tactical moves such as downsizing. Back to you, Jennifer, in the studio.
Great. This was thanks for sharing these great examples and tips. And it seems to me, Zhongming, as we look at these examples and as we listen to you, that there is a very fine balance to strike there between building a resilient portfolio and being transparent towards consumers. What can you say a little bit more about that?
That's indeed, that's very true. So we are able to validate that in some cases, these, for example, the downsizing moves have long-term damage to the brand. Because we handle a lot of product tests, we're able to see that even in the short term, at the trial phase, consumers were happy. They didn't notice the size change, but when they bring the product home, they become a little bit dissatisfied, and actually hurts or damages the reputation or the equity of the brand in the long term. So we really have to be careful with those type of moves, Jennifer.
And monitor very carefully the consumers, I guess, reaction and adoption. Absolutely. And okay, thank you so much. That was really interesting. And now we're going to move on to another area that we need to be thinking about, which is creativity. So Adam, I'm sure everyone is very keen to hear what you have to say and what tips you can give us through your thinking.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jennifer. And I'll be building here in some respects on the theme of differentiation that Zhongming's taken us through for products, but thinking more so then indeed about communication and the role of creativity in communication. How can it help you stand out from the crowd to justify price premiums, to retain and grow market share in these uncertain times? So we'll look at some highlights from an Ipsos perspective on this topic. What creativity means in advertising, where it features in the end effects advertising needs to have to grow brands in the short and the long term. And then I'll hand it to my colleague Ananya, who will take us through a great campaign that will illustrate these principles. Before though we get to these points, firstly, I think we need to recognize the problems that creativity has in advertising. And the first problem really is a lack of confidence that marketers have in creativity, that despite 2 in 3 thinking that creativity can be a tool that can give them a valuable competitive advantage in advertising, only 1 in 10 feel confident that they can make the case for creativity, that they can convince financial decision makers to invest the time, the budget, the resources to get to truly creative and hopefully effective work. And what this means is that we have a creativity gap. We have a gap in confidence from the belief to actually making that case. And why might that be the case? Well, especially in these uncertain times, as human beings, we all gravitate to the safe and familiar choices. We all gravitate to what we know will work rather than what we hope will work. And this is a real tension point in the use of creativity. And what we need, of course, then is more generalizable evidence for its value to make that case. And another, when we think then about advertising itself, it's therefore not surprising that we have this cultivation of conformity. This lack of confidence seeps into the advertising we see on our screens today. We think about auto advertising and the beautiful scenery, the beautiful people, the focus on technical functional features. It all feels very familiar. It all feels like we've seen it before. And the same with beer advertising as another example, the condensation on the bottle, the promise of refreshment. It feels very safe and familiar in marketing to go down this road, but because they're very established category codes, what we can see in the data is that more often than not, this is less effective than taking a creative approach. And another problem that advertising has with creativity is a lack of shared language. If we don't have a shared language for something, how can we hope to use it in businesses to get to more effective outcomes? And what we did in the Ipsos perspective is we profiled a number of opinions and definitions of creativity from industry thought leaders. And some interesting trends and themes emerged in the viewpoint of what creativity means. The first, focusing in a near confrontational way on the value of originality and difference, using words such as chaos, disturbing, breaking things, and subverting expectations. And another theme emerged in this review, again focusing on originality and difference, but in a more nuanced way, using words such as good taste, balance, sincerity. And coming to the goal of advertising, it's only creative if it sells things. And while we can respect lots of different opinions and definitions about what creativity means, an observation we come to in this perspective is that the most important people, excuse me, the most important people in advertising don't really feature in this definition. And that's regular people, the people whose behavior advertising is tasked to influence, but who feature very little, if at all, in the conversation around creativity. So we wanted to bridge that gap in Ipsos to really represent the voice of people in creativity and advertising, to see if we could learn something about what it means and how we can harness it in advertising. And what we did very simply was we asked 20,000 people across 8 countries an open-ended survey question to describe creative advertising they've seen in the past. And what came back in the responses were quite diverse and also illuminating, where we see that, yes, indeed, originality and difference is central to what regular people think about creativity and advertising, represented in the blue at the bottom right of this chart. But it was accompanied by other themes which centre more on the experience of advertising, having fun, being entertained, being interested in what you've seen, and in the yellow, having a feeling of joy, of happiness. And what this really represents is, in addition to originality and difference, it represents value to the end audience. And this is the definition that we propose, coming from the perspective of regular people, that original or different experience that delivers some form of value. And the question is, where does this value appear? Where does it appear in the actual experience of advertising itself? And what can we learn in terms of its relationship to overall effects to get to more effective advertising in these uncertain times? So to answer that question, we did an analysis of thousands of ads in our database, where we looked to group different responses to advertising into overall themes to understand where creativity, if at all, appears. And we found 3 overall advertising experiences. The first is a creative experience, that feeling that the advertising is unique, surprising, it's entertaining and inherently talkable. The second, creative ideas, less about the experience of the advertising itself and more about the information and concepts in the advertising, just the feeling that you've seen something new that you haven't seen before, and by extension, you think the advertised brand is different from others in the category. And finally, empathy and fitting in, less about creativity itself, if anything, more about what fits in, but moreover, this feeling that the advertising is targeted to you, that it represents your world and where the product fits into it, rather than just focusing on communicating the product. And with these 3 advertising experiences in hand, the question we asked ourselves was, where, if at all, does creativity link to advertising effects, and what can we learn from that to get to that more effective advertising in these uncertain times? And a key finding that we found is that creativity does indeed matter to advertising effects, but it only really matters when it's framed in empathy for the audience that you're directing the advertising to. But when you have creativity and empathy together in advertising, you are 20% more likely than average to get a short-term sales lift from the campaign. And a campaign example that I think really illustrates this, this trend is for Volvo. And it's very different to the car advertising that I showed earlier because it focuses on the people. It focuses on the people that Volvo want to appeal to, new parents, their world, and how the car helps them in their world and their challenges and adapting to a new life. And with the safety features of the vehicle, it literally saves their lives. And I really think if there's anything you take away from this short talk, it's really that having empathy for your audience, that yes, entertain them, but frame it in their world, keep it relevant for them, and more likely than not that you'll stand out from the crowds and get to those more effects that you want in these uncertain times in your communication. And just a short mention that this Ipsos perspective will be a published book in the coming weeks that will be available. And at this point, I will hand it to my colleague Ananya, who will take us through another great campaign example that can really illustrate these trends further. Ananya, over to you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you so much for introducing me. Yes, I'm Ananya and from India. So we've heard of this wonderful and relevant framework of Misfits, and therefore I would now like to show you all one such great example from India of an ad for Amazon. So if you could please play that ad for me.
This is not a box. It's a custodian of gems. It's a propeller of a child's imagination. It's a house where playmates can sleep safe and sound. It's a chef's place to keep all secret ingredients. It's an organizer for all things important. See, we told you. This is not just a box. This is a pledge to help make the world a better place. This Global Recycling Day, let's pledge to recycle, to reuse our way.
Thank you so much. So like you saw this beautiful Amazon Not a Box ad, it does have a very, very culturally relatable story arc, and that hits the bullseye on empathy and fitting in. It also has certain elements which is driving the creative effectiveness to a large extent. And I'll tell you why I think and we feel that it really hits the bullseye. It's because, you know, this concept of recycling discarded boxes, that comes naturally to us Indians, okay? And this concept of jugaad, if I were to say, which essentially is, you know, enabling us to use limited resources in innovative ways to solve for a problem, that strikes the chord with the Indian audience. Because most Indian households would have grown up, you know, on these refilled empty jars or bottles of, let's say, you know, the milk food drinks like Bonvita or Horlicks, or even bottles of jams, which were used to kind of set up or use in your kitchen area, or some other boxes which have been used otherwise. However, what we've seen is that with modernism, there was a decline in this trend, and this process of recycling, in a way, faded. There was also to means there was a big uproar at a point in time when companies were started delivering their stuff in these big carton boxes, and there was this uproar around the fact that they were behaving irresponsibly, not responsible towards the environment, and so on. However, on the occasion of Global Recycling Day, when this ad was there, it had that relatability quotient to it. It was a believable story because we have grown up on it, and therefore it turned the game more or less in favor of the brand by taking away that connotation from being a waste product to being a utilitarian product. Finally, it just doesn't end there. It's been able to do this in a very entertaining and engaging manner, and has kept its pulse on the audience engagement part of it. So it also therefore works well on the creativity element. Finally, before they end the ad, they end it with a pledge to make the world a better place. And such causes of sustainability are hot topics and also emotionally connect with the consumers. Thereby, they feeling even more uh, feeling that the ad fits in, they empathize with what is being saying, and that's how it works. So this Amazon Not a Box ad works its magic with the audience and is able to build that empathy and fit in with them, as well as being an effective creative. So that's what I wanted to showcase to you all today. Thank you.
Really, really loved this story, Ananya, and I think it's a great example of how brands can very cleverly sort of work on what's important for people, because it reminds you of so many things. It works on nostalgia, it works on your personal memories. And that's why I want to ask you a little question about your own personal memories. Is that ad relevant to you? Does it bring back memories? Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely, absolutely, Jennifer. Very honestly, the examples I quoted of a Bonvita box, I was a Bonvita user. Grew up on Bonvita as a kid, so I remember the larger volume things in the kitchen. So let's say the pulses, etc., the ones which are larger, used to be stored in the Bonvita containers. The smaller spices, which occupied lesser space, were in the jam bottles. So in a way, the kitchen was made, the sets were made basis, these recycled products. And I myself have used the shoe boxes, which we get as part of my dollhouse, which was a bed for my dolls. And leave alone me, I've personally again restarted recycling, because these bigger boxes that we get, they've become my storehouse for my kids' toys, which are otherwise lying all around. So he's supposed to at least put it in a box and keep it at a place. Things stay together and not all over the place. So this just relates too well to me, just not by stirring my emotional connect and nostalgia, but also relevant to my present day as well.
Great, lovely, lovely stories. And I think there are, although I could smell the Indian spices while you were talking about your kitchen of your childhood, but I can also find some similarities. I grew up in Latin America, and I also used to use shoe boxes for my dolls. So that's a very common trait, I think, across little girls. Great. So thanks very, very much, Ananya. And now for our last piece, we are going to discover whether in these uncertain times that we've been mentioning over and over again, whether there is a new deal at the workplace. And I'm going to hand over to Ghassan, who's going to share some great evidence with us and also some very interesting thinking. So over to you, Ghassan, now.
Thank you, Jennifer. And yes, I mean, it's true to say that the world has changed beyond recognition in many respects over the last 2 or 3 years. And one of the key things is, how do leaders lead in a way that brings people with them and creates that differentiation? This is some of the data that I want to cover off today. But But before I do that, let's recognize that there has been a radical shift that's sped up over the last 2 years. These are trends that have been ongoing, but certainly trends that have accelerated over the last 2 years. 2 to 3 years ago, hardly anyone was working from home. Now it is a common trait in the knowledge sector, and it's one that is increasingly a point of debate on what does hybrid look like? What's the optimum mix of working from home versus from the office? We're seeing different countries, different cultures move at different speeds, but the trend is that more people are coming back into the office, either full-time or part of the time. And that's also causing a challenge for leaders, as well as a question between leaders and employees. Senior leaders across many of the organizations we work with are back in the office predominantly, are wanting their people back in the office. But at the same time, many of their people are saying, no, thank you. We've experienced some great improvements in our work-life balance, in our productivity, and we want to retain elements of the pandemic experience of working partly or fully from home. And that's causing some tensions in organizations. And it's also causing an issue of in some sectors, particularly in IT and others, saying, if you make me come back to the office, partly or fully, it will drive me to potentially look elsewhere as an employer. Now, that is fueling the debate around this issue of the Great Resignation. It's a big story. There's lots of coverage, whether it be in the press or on the news, or indeed in places like Davos. Only a couple of weeks ago, it was a key point of debate around, is talent walking out the door at an unprecedented pace that's causing major talent loss for organizations? And yet it is a big story, but is it a true story? And we at Ipsos have identified a range of data points globally and in particular markets that builds on some of the coverage in places like The Economist and elsewhere, that questions whether the Great Resignation is a real thing, or whether it's hyped, or whether it's a very specific trend in places like the US that isn't being seen elsewhere. And our evidence from millions of employee responses, from millions of data points collected on actual attrition, is that yes, there has been a lift in the last 6 to 12 months in people wanting to leave and in people actually leaving. If you look at Europe-wide actual attrition data, if you look at data in many developing and developed countries, you have seen a shift up. But in many respects, it is a simple correction to pre-pandemic levels. And bar the United States, there is very little evidence that it is accelerated, attrition has accelerated beyond pre-pandemic levels to the record levels that some people are talking about. The question, therefore, is if there is slightly higher attrition, albeit not at the levels that is being hyped to some extent, it's what's causing that? We're seeing that, yes, things like career progression, manager behaviors, pay in a cost of living environment, as we've seen, is a challenge. Sorry.
We can see your screen.
Okay, sorry. We can see that the cost of living is still a challenge. But the big issue for many organizations is this increase in concerns about job stability, about the insecurity, and organizations that are cost cutting, are restructuring, particularly in sectors that have been hit hard, either post pandemic or indeed in the current environment, with pressures on margins, with cost of living and inflationary pressures. Organizations are facing major uncertainty and are cutting back in certain places. And that's causing some employees to think, am I better placed looking for a job in a different sector, for a different employer, where there is more stability and less pressure on me and my work life? And that is the big shift that we've seen in the last 6 to 12 months, whereby uncertainty and workload pressures driven by cost cutting is causing people to look elsewhere. Many of the other key factors that have been with us for a number of years have not changed. They're still the key factors that existed pre-pandemic. So if those are the factors that are driving people to think about leaving, what do leaders do? You know, if job security, cost of living, the hybrid challenge, all of those kind of key hygiene factors of the job are there and are part of the mix of the working environment, can leaders do anything? And our data shows that yes, they can. The culture that leaders create, the behaviors that they exhibit is critical to helping people stay in work, but also stay motivated and focused and productive. We at Ipsos have conducted lots of innovative research that looks at trends in different organizations and within organizations. So this is one large multinational, an image that shows each team, each node being a leader and their team. And the red nodes in a sea of green are underperforming cultures versus green in a sea of red are high-performing cultures in those teams. And when you look at what differentiates those green in a sea of red versus red in a sea of green cultures, you see some very common trends across multiple organizations. Leaders who are visible, who are seen by their people, the whites of their eyes, that is critical. Being open and honest and having a level of frankness about the reality of the situation, the reality of the challenge, as well as the excitement and the inspiration that you as a leader can instill is critical. Fundamentally, the importance of empowering your team, of delegating and listening is one of the most important. And then linked to that is the willingness to be challenged, the humility to know that you're not always right and to bring people with you by being in the trenches with them and being part of the solution, not simply dictating the problem. And I think all four of those taken together is what critically differentiates high-performing cultures versus lower performing cultures. And our data from multiple organizations shows that when you have those four, you have lower attrition, higher sales, higher and improved customer satisfaction. So I think to conclude, the things that we're seeing change have been with us from before the pandemic. We're seeing just an acceleration of some of those trends. And the cost of living crisis, the debate around hybrid, they're going to roll on. What's not going to roll on is the fundamental role that leaders play in motivating their people, in keeping them focused, keeping them productive, but also keeping them with you and making sure that the talent you want to stay stays with you and doesn't leave and go and look for a different job.
Great, thank you so much, Ghassan. Thanks a lot. And this great reminder of the importance of leadership, and even more important in difficult times when employees need to understand stuff and be taken along, is really very interesting. You shared a lot of ideas and things that leaders should be thinking about, but you also mentioned that you've been, working with hundreds and hundreds of companies. You've interviewed thousands of people around the world. So I was wondering if you had to say, from your experience, what is your sort of key takeout of all this? What would your one key thing be for us to keep in mind as we walk away today?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, and it's the foundational issue that any leader needs to create, an environment of psychological safety. If you don't have an environment, if you have an environment where people are afraid to challenge, to question, to ask, then they're not going to critique, they're not going to innovate. And I think all of those things that I've talked about around empowerment and humility and trust, the foundation comes with feeling safe, that you have a trusting relationship with your boss. I've experienced that myself as an employee, and I've tried to instill it in my own organization. And critically, I've seen it in all of those organizations. The ones that truly have innovation have ones where people feel safe to speak out, to differentiate and be different.
Great. Psychological safety is a great summary. Thank you so much to all our speakers and to all of you who've been with us. I just would like to remind everyone that everything that we've showed today is available on our website, so you can easily access all the materials. And I would also like to tell you that we would love to see you back in July for our next keys in which we will talk about change. So thank you, everyone, and bye-bye for now.